Nick, good morning to you.
Morning, Nick.
Thanks very much for joining us. You outlined plans in a letter to stakeholders yesterday as to how you might approach a resumption of racing. How confident are you at this stage that horse racing will return within the month?
We can't be certain, of course, because as you've outlined and as Dave has outlined, there are a number of moving parts. People have talked about returning after lockdown, and of course we don't know what after lockdown means at this stage. The government's still working through its plans on that. What we're focusing on is three things. One, a flexible, phased resumption plan, which Brant Dunshay and Richard Wayman are leading at the BHA's end, but again, it's a collaborative effort across the sport, including a number of leading practitioners, trainers, racecourses and so on. But we must be ready in a risk-managed way to be able to come back in all forms of scenario. And that group has done some excellent work. That means we will be ready to return at short notice whenever the conditions do allow. We will need government on side for that. So that's the first one. And that, if you like, was reflected in the statement we made on Wednesday when we needed to inform people that the current suspension to the end of April that had been in place, it was coming up, obviously, and we needed to make an announcement. It's been reported as indefinite suspension, but actually what we said was that we will be ready to return at any time when the conditions allow after the 1st of May. And we're working on that basis. So that's the first piece of work. The second piece of work is the liaison with government, and this is tricky to get right because government doesn't at the moment want businesses to jump ahead of their own positioning plans to manage the crisis. But we have been placing ourselves in a situation where we can say to them, look, we're not just a sport, we're an industry, we've got 17,500 people directly employed, another 60,000 people whose income substantially relies on it. And whilst that doesn't give us a right to overcome the national effort and position, it does mean that as an industry, we are a powerful support to the economic effort of the country, and we can return behind closed doors as soon as the conditions allow, which means not being an unnecessary drain on the NHS. And we're seeing at the moment that those indicators and those numbers are moving in the right direction. And even with Dominic Raab's announcement of the extension of another 3 weeks a few days ago, he said we are balancing the needs of the crisis and the public's health and welfare with the economic needs of the country. And I think that offers us some hope. And the third area is, as you saw in an announcement yesterday as well, that we've been working on financing and funding to support hardship and cash flow at this time to help our hard-pressed participants, racecourses and other businesses associated to have some emergency support over these next few weeks to fill in some of the gaps between what the government has provided and the particular needs of our sport. Because obviously, and the point that we make regularly to government so that they fully understand, furloughed workers obviously can't look after horses, and racecourses whose income relies on a season from, like a Newton Abbot that relies on a season from March through to September. This is their key time when we could, threaten those businesses, and they need support. So those are the three areas: resumption plans, liaison with government so that we're absolutely there and ready at the right time when we can, when it's possible, and finally looking at support through hardship and cash flow funding.
Nick, I want to talk about liaison with government. Who are you liaising with in government? Who is providing you with the steer on a daily basis, and how clear are those lines of communication?
Well, DCMS is our sponsoring department, as you know, Nick, and we speak with the lead officials each day and with the government ministers, but we have a variety of other contacts in racing. Racing is, I'm not saying in a massively strong position compared with any other industry, but there are very strong connections through our stakeholders, our stakeholder groups like the racecourse groups and so on, but also key individual constituents who have MPs and other senior advisors in the NHS and elsewhere that we can call on. And that dialogue takes place every day. You know, I'm on a call with DCMS with other sports once a week where we have the chance to make the case for resumption. And, you know, many other sports are in this situation. The government is clearly wary about saying things like the greedy Premier League, you know, wants to come back and its footballers are earning lots of money. It's wary about that sort of scenario. But at the same time, it's looking at all the sports that are industries, and there are many like ours that, of course, we're a great sport. Of course, we've got top-level coverage for our key races and so on, but we are a 362-day-a-year racing industry, and, of course, a 365-day industry looking after horses. They understand and appreciate that sports like ours and non-F1 motorsport and, you know, all sorts of other sports out there, like rugby and tennis as well, have a huge industry behind them outside of the top level of the sport, and you know, are losing revenues. Our revenue has obviously been hit very hard during this time, and that's the same as other sports. So once a week we have the chance to keep updating the Sports Minister and the Secretary of State for DCMS, and behind the scenes with the various officials and other supporters like the all-party racing group who've been very helpful throughout this period, the joint chairs particularly, Lawrence Robertson and Conor McGinn. We're working with these people to help ensure that we're in the best possible place to make the case to be ready for return at the very shortest notice.
Have you personally been contacted by either the Minister of Sport or the Secretary of State for Culture, Media and Sport?
Not personally directly, but we have some time planned in coming up with them. But we have had dialogue, as I say, in these weekly meetings. We work with the officials, with Anna, who's the lead official there, who's the head of sport, and it's that where the work gets done on the ground. But we have a network of MPs and other influential people in Parliament who we're constantly contacting, asking for their help, liaising in there. So the individual meeting coming up will help us a great deal on this, but the Minister has acknowledged our situation on the calls. I've had the chance to speak up and raise questions. Those questions have been taken on board, and we've had follow-up from the department. So the DCMS is very much on side.
But would you accept that they really need to engage with you? Clearly everybody is engaged in the coronavirus crisis, in whatever department they are in, but it is their responsibility at the DCMS to make sure that industry is protected, workforce is protected, safety is maintained, welfare is maintained. And you surely, as someone who's in charge of a multi-million-pound industry that needs to find a way forward and needs to find a way through the crisis, you surely need to be in a position to be sitting down in front of, if not the Secretary of State, at least the Minister for Sport, and I would argue, for at least a few moments every week.
Well, Nick, we are pursuing these discussions. People are listening, and you know, I've been out of the game for 2 weeks, as you may know myself.
Yeah.
But that's why we've sought meetings directly. There has been time with the all-party racing group. There has been time with leaders across the industry, with the Minister and other officials in DCMS. We are not in. We're not out of contact with these people. We're not outside influencing these people. There are letters going backwards and forwards. I'm not sure it's realistic every week to have time with the Minister, but we will be having time with the Minister over the next week. So, look, this is not being neglected at all. There are groups of people at industry level. There's a public affairs group working on this. We have daily liaison with the department. I don't think it's realistic to have daily liaison with the Minister, but daily liaison with the department. And we are making our case, and that case is clearly understood, so that we are ready for a return.
There are so many different areas here that we need to talk about. One of them is the new fixture list, or a fixture list that you are trying to fashion based on when the government give you clearance to proceed in any of the three phases, either heavily quarantined behind closed doors or some resumption with crowds, which would be much later down the year. What did you make of Ascot announcing that they were intending to go ahead behind closed doors? Was that a decision that had the collaborative agreement of all stakeholders, or was that a decision that they made alone?
Well, I think their message actually was, we will not be racing with a crowd. And at the moment, we still intend racing if it's possible, if government supports us and if the governing body of the sport allows it to go ahead. But obviously, I think it was taken a bit differently in one of the interviews that took place at the time. The support supported their position. We understand the need to help their economic situation. They had to make some decisions about set-up costs and so on. I'm sure insurances were part of it as well. And they want to inform their potential customers about the fact that, they'd made the decision that if racing did go ahead, it will not go ahead with crowds. And I think that communication is fine, but it did come at a time where, the media and the national mood was, if we can misinterpret things, perhaps we will on this sort of stuff. So I think their decision is absolutely fine.
And on that point, I must return to Cheltenham. I've gone on record as saying in the immediate week after Cheltenham, so I don't want to sound remotely hypocritical here, that Cheltenham were right to go ahead because it was the government advice at the time. But figures released today have shown that Gloucestershire Hospital's NHS Trust have recorded a mortality figure of 107 COVID-19 related deaths, relative to 54, which is the next highest death count in South West Hospitals Trust. Now, 2 and 2 being put together may well make 5 or 6 here. We need more evidence to say that a big event was a direct link to that. But people will infer from those numbers that there was a link, and it won't stop Piers Morgan tomorrow on Good Morning Britain questioning people on it, as he has done throughout, and whipped up a furore. How worried are you as the leader of the sport that the Cheltenham aftermath is going to cast a pall over what you can do now, how you can go forward?
Well, I think obviously there's a lot of comment, isn't there, about and a lot of blame around. You have to put into context. The decision to go ahead with Cheltenham was taken in conjunction with government advice and government's scientific and medical advice. Many other activities took place that week. We had a Premiership football weekend beforehand, Six Nations rugby match on the Sunday, I think.
Yeah.
Crufts took place indoors. Millions of people were still going down the tube in London. And the advice was keep going, then things changed that week. I know we don't need to go over that so much. Of course, we should be, I guess, a little bit worried, not necessarily because of the decisions taken around that, but because of the perception of it, and we do have to try and manage the perception of it. I think if we'd, I think if you can try and wind back to the Tuesday of that week, I think if we'd cancelled racing against government advice at that time for Cheltenham, I just don't think it would have been the right decision. It would have been widely criticised as being somewhat alarmist, I think. But the mood did change that week. It did change that week because Rishi Sunak came out with his budget on the Wednesday. There was a more worried update from government from Boris Johnson on the Thursday. And then quickly we got into the next week on the Monday, and things had changed very, very rapidly, straight into, limitations on gatherings, drains on public services, and a much different mood and a scientific message that was coming through differently. I think the key about Cheltenham is that we need to be very, very careful in that context, just around how we manage the messaging to government and the public about our return. If we show that we're looking to go ahead of a reasonable position, then that could attract significant criticism. We have to bear that in mind. We're balancing on a knife edge to make sure that we return as quickly as possible, but with government on side and the public on side.
You made an interesting point earlier about racecourses and insurance and securing their own financial futures. How is it possible for you and your hard-working team to fashion a fixture list when it could be much more beneficial to many racecourses to simply cancel and take the insurance money?
Yeah, well, there are a couple of things. First of all, there's the conditions to return. So is a racecourse able to race behind closed doors with the conditions in place that we will require, which may require some level of testing of individuals, either before they go to the racecourse or when they arrive. And we need certain types of facilities in place to help ensure social distancing and so on. That assessment is going on now around which racecourses. Some will want to hand fixtures back wrong phrase. Some will want to cancel their fixtures, as we've seen already, for the various purposes. But there are racecourses who want to race, who can meet the conditions. You'll be speaking to a group later on where I'm sure ARC is looking to in the right circumstances and has certain racecourses. But there are other racecourses too across the country. And the effort that I'd like to thank the Racing Foundation and Levy Board for in providing the package this week for hardship and cash flow. Part of the consideration at the Levy Board, certainly, which I'm a member and which sat this week, is to ensure that there is funding to help support the return in an environment where media rights money may not be fully available because betting shops could still be closed, and where the income flows are reduced. So we will need a war chest at the Levy Board to help racecourses to be able to race. We will have to provide the right conditions and incentivise racecourses to be able to race during that time. It does give the chance to have a proper coordinated set of scenarios that can suit our industry, irrespective of the base fixture list that's in place. And the team involved across the industry is working to deliver that. But we'll have to provide incentive and stimulus to help ensure that we can have a programme to return to.
Every conversation I've had with you suggests that on one hand, you want to ensure that racing gets back as safely and as quickly as possible within the framework that the government laid down. But on the other hand, you understand racing's place in the country's standing, or the racing standing in the context of what's happening in the country. Whose idea was it then for government to be lobbied for owners to have tax relief, personal income tax relief? Surely that doesn't tally with your own personal position.
Well, government has been very clear with us, and DCMS very clear with us from the early stages, the early discussions held by the Secretary of State and the Sports Minister with sports, that they wanted to hear very clearly what support could be needed by each individual sport outside of the government's help. And we have a situation where, owners are really important for our sport, and many have been absolutely magnificent during this time. I've spoken to a number of trainers over the last few weeks. And, yes, some horses are being lost, and yes, we're hearing about that. And of course, that's inevitable. But many, many owners are sticking with it, taking their responsibilities for their horses, even though they have no prospect of racing over the next couple of weeks, very seriously, and supporting their trainers. And that's fantastic to see. We were asked by government to explore all areas that could possibly help. The industry's group worked on proposals. Most of the decisions here, the BHA can lead and coordinate, but we have to have our industry on side. Nearly all the decisions that are going to be taken during this crisis are not regulatory decisions. They're governing decisions where the BHA needs to work across the sport. And we asked people for what support could help, and we put that into government. I don't think we're not pursuing that at the moment in terms of one of the issues to raise. And in fact, some of the plans around that were, set aside. But it was one of the options that could help. Owners put in a huge amount to our sport. They stimulate the demand in our sport. And they're going to be very important during this time that they stick with us. So it was set out as an example from the industry of where some help could be given. We're not lobbying for it. We've in effect we're amending the guidance that's going to those who are seeking to seek resumption and support from their local MPs and so on, because we are asking people to contact their local MPs and explain the situation. But we're not majoring on that, and we're not majoring on the match funding aspect either that we put in. But we may need to go back to government at some point and say we need more help, because furloughed workers can't look after horses, so training businesses are having to keep workers on and aren't getting direct relief for the employment costs for those people, like those in the furloughed scheme.
How many racecourses do you think will be forced to close?
I don't know, Nick. I'd like to think that if we can get racing, within the timescales that we would all hope, that are indicated, if you like, by the statement that went to trainers and owners and other industry participants on Friday night. I'd like to think that we can support as many as we can. The hardship and cash flow funding from the Levy Board and the Racing Foundation does provide quite a bit of cash flow and other assistance for racecourses, and we would particularly hope that those most vulnerable ones can take best advantage of it. But, not everyone may be able to be saved, Nick. I just don't know. Coming out of this crisis, obviously the world is going to be a different place. And not every business, organisation, individual, of course, can survive. But we'll do our best to provide the environment in the short to medium term until we get back racing to try and help these courses to get through, because they're an important part of the fabric of our sport and they provide fixtures at key times.
I know this is a very, very difficult time for everybody. I realise that you are trying to navigate some extremely choppy waters. How unified now do you think the industry is?
Well, look, as I said before, the BHA has to lead and be the spokesperson for decisions that are taken, but the vast majority of decisions that the sport needs to take at the moment are not regulatory, and therefore, under the way in which our sport is set up, they involve the members of our sport, the tripartite members of our sport, the racecourses, our participants, and of course the BHA. So we can only make decisions when we work collaboratively together. And I have seen over the last 6-7 weeks, yes, a lot of challenge and difficulty and fear, and of course, self-interest, because leaders have to look after their own constituents within the industry. But I've seen a tremendous working spirit as well of coordination amongst those leaders who work day in, day out on the policy and the strategies that we have to employ. The sport, I think, is very together. We have got a lot of criticism from individuals I know who want more clarity, who want more certainty, who want more help, who want us to be able to say, we will start on date X. But we also have a load of other people who are saying, you can't say date X because you'll provoke us into the wrong position with the national mood and at government level. So they understand it. So there's disagreement about what's going on. And of course there's challenge. And, people are very worried for their businesses. And I think we just have to try and stick together as best we can. Everyone in the sport wants racing to be able to return and get going again. Everyone at the BHA and amongst the sports leaders understands the implications on trainers, owners, other participants in the sport, racecourses. Everyone understands the implications on the classic generation, the 2-year-old generation, the knock-on implication for the sales and breeding. And we are doing all that we can to return as quickly as possible and provide as much support as we can along the way.
Nick Russ, thank you very much indeed.